The chamber was silent, the kind of silence that hums with tension, when Clarence Thomas leaned forward and delivered words that seemed to cut the air in half. "You," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to slice, "are disrespecting tradition." It wasn't just an accusation. It was a condemnation, a declaration that echoed against the marble walls as though it had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. Every head in the room turned toward Jasmine Crockett. Some mouths dropped open. Some smirked, sensing the storm that was about to break. Cameras zoomed in, lights glaring off polished wood, amplifying the heat of the moment. Crockett didn't flinch. Her chin lifted, eyes locked on Thomas with a calm that was sharper than any insult. That calm said, "I've been here before. I know this game. And I am not the one who will bow." Whispers broke out along the rows of aides and staffers, a wave of disbelief washing across the chamber. The phrase, disrespecting tradition, carried weight, loaded with centuries of hierarchy, of old men deciding what counted as dignity and what counted as rebellion. Coming from Clarence Thomas, it carried even more venom. He was a man who had sat on the highest court for decades, cloaked in power, untouchable. To call out a younger black woman lawmaker in that way was more than a rebuke. It was a challenge. Crockett leaned slightly forward, her lips parting, but she didn't respond immediately. That silence stretched like a taut wire, daring him, daring the room, daring America itself to measure who truly embodied tradition. The audience watching at home didn't just see a political disagreement. They saw a clash of eras, of philosophies, of identities colliding in real time. Was tradition obedience to outdated power? Or was tradition the unrelenting push to expand freedom and truth, no matter the cost? Every second of her pause felt like a countdown. Reporters scribbled frantically, knowing this was more than a quote, it was history being born under fluorescent lights. Phones buzzed in pockets as aides texted updates, "You're not going to believe this. It just happened." And then, as the air thickened with anticipation, Crockett's lips curved ever so slightly, as though she knew exactly how the next moment would unfold. What happened next would leave not just the chamber, but the entire country, in stunned disbelief. To understand why Clarence Thomas's words carried such explosive weight, you have to trace the path that led to that charged moment. This wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was the collision of two Americas, the one clinging to the past and the one fighting to claim the future. For decades, Thomas had sat on the Supreme Court bench as the most enigmatic of figures. Rarely speaking in public, yet always present in rulings that tightened the grip of tradition, hierarchy, and control. His silence was his armor, his judgments his weapon. When he finally spoke, people listened, if only because they knew his voice carried the authority of permanence. To hear that same voice accuse Jasmine Crockett of disrespecting tradition was not merely courtroom theater. It was a reminder of who had been permitted to define tradition all along. For decades, Thomas had sat on the Supreme Court bench as the most enigmatic of figures. Rarely speaking in public, yet always present in rulings that tightened the grip of tradition, hierarchy, and control. His silence was his armor, his judgments his weapon. When he finally spoke, people listened, if only because they knew his voice carried the authority of permanence. To hear that same voice accuse Jasmine Crockett of disrespecting tradition was not merely courtroom theater. It was a reminder of who had been permitted to define tradition all along. Crockett, by contrast, represented the opposite trajectory. A first-term congresswoman from Texas, unapologetically black, unapologetically bold, unafraid to raise her voice where others might have lowered theirs. To her supporters, she wasn't just another politician, she was proof that power could look different, sound different, demand different. Her presence in that chamber symbolized a crack in the wall of what tradition had always meant in America. And that was exactly why his words stung so deeply. Disrespecting tradition wasn't just about Crockett's style, her tone, or even her politics. It was about identity. It was about whose story America had been built to honor, and whose story had always been dismissed. It was about the unwritten rule that deference was owed to those who had already claimed the stage, while newcomers, especially women of color, were expected to play supporting roles. The nation watching saw more than two public figures locked in debate. They saw centuries of power dynamics compressed into a single exchange. Every immigrant who had been told to know your place, every worker who had been told this is just how it's always been done, every young activist who had been told to wait their turn, they all saw themselves reflected in the space between Thomas's accusation and Crockett's silence. It mattered because America has always wrestled with tradition. On one side, tradition is framed as dignity, stability, continuity. On the other, it is recognized as the chains that kept voices out, that resisted progress until the very last possible moment. This wasn't just Thomas accusing Crockett of violating etiquette. It was an elder of the old guard trying to slam the door shut on a voice that dared to break through. And Crockett knew it. Her pause wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. She understood that every word she chose would carry beyond those walls. That millions would clip, share, meme, and replay her answer. That her response would either validate every critic who said she was too brash, or crown her as the fearless truth-teller who refused to be boxed in by someone else's definition of respect. The stakes weren't just political. They were personal, cultural, generational. In the silence after Thomas's accusation, America wasn't waiting for a soundbite. It was waiting to see whether dignity could still defeat arrogance, whether truth could stand tall against hierarchy. And when Crockett finally opened her mouth to speak, it became instantly clear, what happened next would change everything. Clarence Thomas has always been a study in contradictions, a man who rose from humble beginnings only to become the staunch defender of a system that often shuts out people who look like him. Born into poverty in Pin Point, Georgia, abandoned by his father, and raised by his grandparents, his early life was the very embodiment of struggle and perseverance. For a time, it seemed his journey would become a story of overcoming, a testament to resilience. Yet, somewhere along the way, Thomas transformed from a symbol of possibility into a guardian of the very gates he once had to climb. His ascent to the Supreme Court in 1991 was itself steeped in drama. The hearings that introduced him to America were charged with allegations, testimony, and the unforgettable voice of Anita Hill, who accused him of sexual harassment. The nation was divided, some viewing him as the victim of a smear campaign, others as the embodiment of unchecked power. His narrow confirmation left scars on American political discourse that never quite healed. But once he secured his lifetime seat, Thomas cloaked himself in silence, rarely speaking during oral arguments, cultivating the image of a man above the fray. That silence, however, masked something more corrosive. While he claimed to be the quiet custodian of tradition, his legacy became intertwined with a conservative movement increasingly hostile to progress. His rulings and votes routinely sided with the forces of regression, restricting voting rights, narrowing protections for minorities, upholding decisions that tilted power toward corporations and away from ordinary citizens. He presented himself as principled, yet those principles often seemed to align conveniently with those who already held power. And then came the revelations that stripped the veneer of dignity from his carefully crafted image. Reports emerged of billionaire benefactors providing him with lavish gifts, luxury vacations, private jets, tuition for relatives, all hidden from the public eye. For a man who railed against corruption, who preached about the sanctity of law and tradition, the hypocrisy was breathtaking. Ordinary Americans watched as Clarence Thomas, the supposed steward of integrity, lived a life of luxury bankrolled by the very elites whose interests his rulings often benefited. The contradictions piled up. He spoke of tradition, yet lived outside the reach of accountability. He invoked morality, yet his past was shadowed by allegations of misconduct. He claimed impartiality, yet his alliances tethered him to the most partisan corners of American power. The more he leaned on the word tradition, the more it became clear that what he truly meant was preservation of privilege, preservation of a hierarchy where voices like his sat at the top and voices like Jasmine Crockett's were expected to bow. Arrogance seeped through every carefully measured word. To Thomas, Crockett's boldness wasn't just an annoyance, it was an existential threat. She represented everything his career had worked to suppress, a woman of color unafraid to wield power in spaces that once excluded her. She didn't whisper, she didn't wait her turn, she didn't soften her words to soothe fragile egos. In his world, that wasn't courage, it was disrespect. And so he lashed out with the weapon he had always wielded best, the language of tradition, twisted into a shield for his own authority. But history has a way of catching up to even the most insulated figures. The contradictions that Thomas carried, his humble origins versus his elite indulgences, his silence versus his behind-the-scenes maneuvering, his public piety versus his private entanglements, were beginning to erode the myth of his invincibility. Every headline about secret gifts chipped away at the marble statue image. Every revelation about his ties to wealthy patrons reminded Americans that tradition, in his mouth, sounded less like integrity and more like entitlement. By the time he sat across from Jasmine Crockett, Thomas was already wobbling on the pedestal he had occupied for so long. He may have believed that his words would land like thunder, silencing her with the weight of his authority. But to the millions watching, his accusation carried the stench of hypocrisy. How could a man who accepted luxury vacations from billionaires lecture anyone about respect for tradition? How could a figure whose career was shadowed by scandal presume to define dignity for others? The tension in the chamber wasn't just about one exchange. It was about years of mounting contradictions finally coming to a head. The audience could feel it, this wasn't the beginning of a clash. It was the culmination of one. Clarence Thomas, once untouchable, now stood vulnerable, his words exposing the hollowness of the pedestal beneath him. And so, as he leveled his charge against Jasmine Crockett, the stage was set not for her humiliation, but for his unraveling. The audience didn't know exactly what she would say in response, but they knew one thing with certainty: the weight of his arrogance was about to meet the force of her truth. And when those forces collided, something would have to give. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin in marble chambers or gilded halls. It begins in the everyday struggles of a family that knew what it meant to work hard, to stretch a dollar, to live with the weight of dreams that always seemed just a little out of reach. She was raised in Texas, where the dust of the land carried both the scars of history and the stubborn hope of people who refused to give up. For Crockett, childhood was not a glide into privilege, it was a climb, one step at a time, each step earned, each step teaching her that dignity is never given, it is fought for. Education was her ticket, though that ticket came stamped with sacrifices. There were late nights hunched over books while friends went out, endless hours spent in debate clubs, community work, and volunteer projects that never made the news but shaped her into the fighter she would become. The daughter of working-class parents, she carried their lessons like armor: never let anyone tell you where you belong. Stand tall, even when you feel small. Speak, even when the room tries to silence you. When she pursued law, it wasn't because she wanted prestige. It was because she had seen what injustice looked like up close. In communities across Texas, she saw young men and women, many who looked like her, treated as though their lives mattered less. She watched families broken by a justice system that worked faster to punish than it ever did to protect. The law, in its purest form, is supposed to be a shield for the vulnerable. But Crockett saw how easily it was twisted into a sword for the powerful. That fire burned in her, a conviction that if no one else would stand up for those voices, then she would. Her early years as a public defender were a battlefield. She walked into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients from the moment they entered. She fought cases that seemed impossible, not for glory, not for headlines, but because she knew each person deserved someone who believed in their humanity. Sometimes she won, sometimes she lost, but every case etched deeper into her what it meant to fight against systems designed to crush. And make no mistake, she paid for her convictions. The hours were brutal, the pay meager. There were nights when she questioned whether the grind was worth it, whether her voice could ever make a dent in the machinery of injustice. Yet she kept going, because to stop would mean conceding to a world where silence was survival. She refused that world. She chose to speak. That choice propelled her into politics, not because she craved the spotlight, but because she realized that the laws she fought in courtrooms were written by people in power. And if those people didn't understand the pain of the communities she came from, then the cycle would never end. Entering public office was not an escape from the fight, it was her escalation of it. Her rise to Congress was anything but conventional. Crockett brought the fire of a courtroom advocate into the halls of politics. She wasn't interested in the polite, performative language of, "wait your turn." She believed in saying what needed to be said, even if it ruffled feathers, even if it drew criticism. Critics called her brash, uncompromising, loud. Supporters called her authentic, fearless, and necessary. She didn't just carry the stories of her constituents, she embodied them. The immigrant mother working 3 jobs, the young black student told to lower her voice, the factory worker forgotten by policymakers, Crockett spoke for them all. Every speech, every vote, every confrontation was shaped by the years she spent fighting in courtrooms for those who had no one else. It's easy to underestimate someone like her, to dismiss her as just another loud voice in a crowded chamber. But that's what Thomas and others like him never understood. Crockett's loudness wasn't born of arrogance, it was born of necessity. When you spend years watching the powerful ignore the pleas of the vulnerable, you learn that whispers don't move mountains. Shouts do. And so, when she faced Clarence Thomas, she wasn't just a freshman congresswoman staring down a Supreme Court justice. She was the culmination of every sacrifice her family made, every night she spent studying instead of resting, every case she fought for someone who thought the system had already decided their fate. She was the daughter of struggle, the student of resilience, the lawyer forged in fire, the representative who refused to shrink. The irony was sharp. Thomas tried to box her in with the word, tradition, but it was Crockett who embodied America's truest tradition, the tradition of fighters who rise from nothing, who challenge entrenched power, who refuse to bow to intimidation. Her journey had uniquely prepared her for this moment. The same steel that carried her through underfunded schools, through hostile courtrooms, through political dismissals, now gave her the poise to stare down a man who believed his authority was untouchable. As she lifted her head and prepared to speak, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett standing there. It was every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was every child who had ever wondered if their voice could matter. She carried them all in that chamber. And that's why, when Clarence Thomas's accusation hung heavy in the air, Crockett didn't buckle. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She let the weight of her silence sharpen the anticipation, because she knew, this was more than a debate. This was destiny calling her to fire back with the truth she had been preparing her whole life to tell. The chamber should have cooled after Clarence Thomas's first rebuke. Instead, the air grew hotter, thicker, as though the words he had chosen had struck a match in a room already laced with gasoline. Crockett's silence stretched on, deliberate, powerful, unsettling. And Thomas, unused to silence being wielded against him, mistook it for hesitation. He leaned forward again, his voice heavier this time, his tone dripping with paternal scorn. "This is exactly what has gone wrong with our politics," he declared, his gaze fixed on her like a teacher scolding a child. Angry. Loud. Disrespectful. Our institutions deserve better than this kind of conduct. The words didn't just land, they echoed. Angry. Loud. Disrespectful. He chose them carefully, the same words too often weaponized against women who dared to speak boldly, against black voices that refused to soften their truth. His tone implied that Crockett's very presence, her refusal to bow her head, was a violation of decorum. It was the oldest trick in the book: reduce your opponent not by dismantling their argument, but by questioning their character. Whispers broke out in the gallery. Aides scribbled furiously. A senator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And somewhere in the press pool, a reporter muttered under their breath, "This is about to go viral." Because everyone in that room knew what Thomas had just done. He hadn't merely criticized a colleague's words, he had reduced her identity to a caricature. The chamber, always sensitive to the scent of blood, leaned in. Pundits, already perched in front of cameras outside, were salivating, ready to spin whichever side faltered. Crockett's eyes narrowed, but her lips pressed into a line of restraint. She didn't lash out. Not yet. Instead, she shifted slightly in her seat, the movement small but sharp, like a blade being unsheathed in slow motion. The silence between his last word and her eventual response was a silence laced with anticipation, the kind that makes even seasoned politicians glance around nervously. Thomas, emboldened by her quiet, raised his chin and repeated his indictment. "Respect for tradition is not optional," he said, his voice louder now, bouncing against the high ceilings. "If you cannot understand that, then perhaps you are not ready to serve in these halls." The arrogance was palpable. It wasn't just about rules, it was about authority, about hierarchy, about reminding Crockett, and anyone like her, that they were guests in a house built by others. His words dared her to know her place. The tension was unbearable. On social media, clips were already being shared, spliced mid-sentence, captions blazing across the screen. Justice Thomas calls out Crockett for disrespecting tradition. Comment sections erupted with defenders and critics alike. People who weren't even watching live now felt their phones buzz with the breaking moment. Inside the chamber, Crockett finally inhaled, slow and steady. She adjusted the microphone before her, the faint scratch of movement amplified through the speakers like the clearing of a throat before a symphony begins. Eyes darted. Was this the moment? Would she erupt? Would she confirm his caricature, or would she demolish it? Her hand hovered just above the table, fingers drumming once, twice, then still. That subtle rhythm betrayed the storm she kept contained. Every muscle in her body seemed poised on the edge of release. And yet, she waited. The silence stretched again, longer this time, but charged not with submission, charged with anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. The gallery knew. The reporters knew. The country, glued to their screens, knew. Crockett wasn't folding. She was sharpening, coiling, drawing in the energy of the moment until it became too heavy to ignore. And as the room tilted in her direction, as Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair despite the firmness of his voice, it became undeniable, the storm was coming. The chamber could feel it in the stillness, in the weight of the pause before the strike. A storm about to break. For a beat, the room stayed suspended in silence, as though everyone had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Clarence Thomas's words still hung in the air, angry, loud, disrespectful, but their echo was about to meet a force far stronger than condescension. Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her posture composed, her expression unflinching. Her voice, when it finally came, wasn't loud. It was measured, deliberate, like the opening note of a symphony. "Justice Thomas," she began, her tone steady enough to slice through the chamber, "you talk about tradition as if it were a shield. As if invoking that word absolves you, or anyone, from scrutiny." The chamber froze. Crockett had chosen not to match his volume but to weaponize precision. Every word felt sharpened, honed, impossible to dismiss. She paused, letting the silence carry the weight of her next line. "But let's be honest, whose tradition are we talking about here?" Gasps whispered through the gallery. Pencils stopped scratching. All eyes locked on her. Thomas shifted in his seat, the faintest flicker of unease crossing his face. He hadn't expected a counterattack delivered with such surgical calm. Crockett pressed forward, each word falling like a hammer. "Tradition, you say? Was it tradition when women were told their voices didn't belong in this chamber? Was it tradition when immigrants were treated as if they were parasites instead of builders of this nation? Was it tradition when black men and women were denied the very right to vote? Because if that's the tradition you want to defend, then let the record show, it's not tradition. It's oppression, wrapped in marble and ceremony." A ripple surged through the audience. Some gasped. Others nodded fiercely. A young staffer in the back pressed a hand to her chest, as though the words had struck her directly. Crockett leaned closer to the mic, her voice lower now, forcing everyone to lean in. "I will not apologize for being loud when injustice screams louder. I will not apologize for being angry when corruption dares to wear the robes of respectability. And I will not apologize for disrespecting a tradition that has disrespected my people for centuries. The chamber thundered, not yet applause, but the raw, uncontrolled sound of energy breaking free. Murmurs, shouts, a few claps before being stifled by stern glares from officials. But the momentum was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Thomas tried to interject, his lips parting, but Crockett raised her hand, calm, commanding, almost regal. The gesture silenced him before he could even speak. The visual was devastating, a black congresswoman halting a Supreme Court justice with nothing more than presence. Her eyes locked on his, unblinking, piercing. You tell me tradition matters. Let me tell you what matters. Justice. Equality. Integrity. Tradition doesn't mean clinging to corruption. Tradition doesn't mean selling your voice to billionaires while calling it principle. Tradition means fighting for justice. And that's exactly what I'm doing. The words cracked like thunder. Gasps erupted. A wave of applause surged despite desperate attempts from the presiding officer to maintain order. Thomas, for once, looked unsettled. His hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles pale, his jaw tightening as if he were biting back the urge to respond. But Crockett wasn't finished. Her voice rose, not with anger but with righteous conviction. You can call me angry, Justice Thomas. You can call me loud. You can even call me disrespectful. But history will call me something else, unafraid. And that's what terrifies you most. The room exploded. Applause broke through, unstoppable this time. The gallery shook with it, as if the chamber's very walls could no longer contain the energy. Staffers whispered, reporters typed furiously, and cameras clicked like a storm of shutters capturing history in real time. But Crockett wasn't grandstanding. She leaned in again, her voice softer now, yet somehow more dangerous. You talk about respect for institutions. I respect this country enough to demand it live up to its promise. I respect the people who sent me here enough to refuse silence. And I respect tradition enough to remember that the greatest American tradition is rebellion against tyranny. Her words carved through the chamber, leaving no safe corner for indifference. Even her critics looked rattled, as though they understood they were witnessing something that could not be spun away by talking points. Thomas cleared his throat, tried again to interrupt, but Crockett held her ground, her stare unwavering. You ask me to bow to tradition. I ask you, when you accepted gifts and favors from billionaires, was that tradition? When you undermined the rights of millions of women with the stroke of a pen, was that tradition? When you sat silent while corruption spread through the highest court of this land, was that your idea of respect? Gasps turned to shouts of agreement. Someone in the back whispered, she's ending him. Crockett raised her chin. You don't get to lecture me about tradition, Justice Thomas. Not when you've chosen power over principle. Not when you've sold your legacy for luxury. Not when the only tradition you're defending is the one that says people like me should sit down and stay quiet. I won't. Not today. Not ever. The words detonated. Applause roared, this time deafening, unstoppable. The presiding officer's gavel drowned out completely. Reporters rushed to text editors, clips shot across social media before Crockett had even finished her sentence. Hashtags began to form in real time. Thomas sat rigid, his face a mask of composure barely holding. But his eyes betrayed him, they darted, unsettled, as though for the first time in years he realized he had been cornered not by another justice, not by a seasoned senator, but by a freshman congresswoman armed only with truth. Crockett, breathing steady, allowed the applause to crest and settle. Then she delivered the final blow. Tradition doesn't belong to those who cling to power. It belongs to those who dare to make this nation better. That's the tradition I serve. And whether you respect it or not, it will outlast you. The chamber roared again, echoing like a verdict. Gasps, applause, chants rising in the gallery. The presiding officer's gavel pounded uselessly against the desk. And through it all, Clarence Thomas sat frozen, visibly rattled, his authority punctured in full view of the nation. Crockett's voice carried above the din one last time, crisp, cutting, unforgettable. "Mark my words, this is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning." The crowd rose. Phones buzzed. Cameras rolled. And in the split second before the clip began its viral journey, before hashtags lit up the internet, before late-night hosts and pundits seized the moment, the chamber seemed to pulse with the same thought. Once her words hit the internet, the world erupted. The instant Jasmine Crockett's words landed, the chamber was electric. But outside those marble walls, something even more explosive was happening. Within seconds, the clip had been uploaded, retweeted, shared, and dissected. The algorithm caught fire. By the time Crockett had returned to her seat, the moment was already spiraling across every platform like a lightning strike splitting the night sky. On Twitter, now branded X, the hashtag tradition versus truth surged into the trending bar, followed closely by hashtag Crockett clapback and hashtag Thomas exposed. TikTok teens stitched the clip with dance tracks, while activists layered it over protest footage, framing Crockett as the face of a new resistance. Memes appeared at lightning speed, Thomas's scowling face captioned with, "Tradition equals my way or no way," contrasted with Crockett's fierce gaze, headlined, "This is what tradition looks like now." Cable news producers scrambled. Within an hour, every network led with the confrontation, looping Crockett's mic drop line like a national anthem. On progressive channels, pundits nearly glowed with admiration, calling it a defining stand for generational justice. On conservative outlets, anchors leaned into outrage, painting Crockett as the dangerous future Democrats want. The split screen told a deeper story. This wasn't just a political exchange, it was a cultural earthquake. Celebrities jumped in. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Tradition means fighting for justice." Jasmine Crockett just gave America a new definition. Iconic. John Legend shared the clip with the caption, "Mic dropped. Forever." Even unexpected voices, athletes, influencers, immigrant entrepreneurs, shared their own reflections, tying Crockett's words to their struggles, their families, their communities. But the reactions weren't confined to hashtags and hot takes. On the ground, people felt something shift. College students in dorm lounges cheered as they replayed the video, fists pumping like they were watching a championship game. Community leaders in churches and mosques quoted Crockett's words during sermons, framing her stand as a moral victory for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. In immigrant households, parents pointed at the screen and told their kids, "See? That's what it means to stand tall." Even in Washington, the tremors could be felt. Lawmakers who had once dismissed Crockett as too green now spoke of her with cautious respect. Allies whispered that she had become a symbol, a new kind of political weapon, one who could fight with both fire and precision. Enemies muttered about her being dangerous, precisely because she'd proven she could ignite a movement with just a few sentences. Yet the most telling sign wasn't in the headlines or the sound bites. It was in the fear rippling through the old guard. Thomas, once untouchable, suddenly looked vulnerable. His defenders struggled to reframe the moment, but every attempt fell flat against the viral power of Crockett's takedown. Each time they tried to paint her as disrespectful, the internet replayed his own contradictions, his own long record of shielding corruption under the banner of tradition. By nightfall, one truth was undeniable: this was bigger than Crockett versus Thomas. It was America itself, split down the seam between those who feared the loss of old traditions and those who believed true tradition meant progress, justice, and courage. And as the hashtags kept climbing, as the memes kept multiplying, as the commentators kept declaring this the moment of the decade, one question hung in the air: if a single speech could ignite this much energy, what would happen when that energy turned into action? The answer was coming, and the nation wasn't ready for the storm about to break. In the days after her viral stand, Jasmine Crockett did something rare in politics: she refused to bask in the glow. No self-congratulatory tour, no endless interviews. Instead, she returned to the House floor, calm but resolute, ready to deliver a message not just to her colleagues but to a nation glued to every word. The chamber was quieter this time, no jeers, no interruptions. Even Thomas sat with tightened lips, the sting of defeat still fresh. Crockett began not with triumph, but with humility. "I've been told," she said, her voice steady, "that I don't understand tradition. That my presence here, my voice here, somehow threatens the way things have always been. But let me remind us all, America's greatest tradition has never been obedience to the past. It has always been reinvention." She paused, letting the words settle. The weight of history seemed to lean into her. "Our true tradition," she continued, "is found in every generation that dared to demand more, freedom when there was bondage, suffrage when there was silence, dignity when there was degradation. Progress through struggle, that is the inheritance we've been given." The chamber shifted. Members leaned forward. Her tone softened, but the force behind her words only grew. "Tradition is the immigrant mother who teaches her child a language she was once punished for speaking. Tradition is the young man marching across a bridge in Selma with nothing but faith to protect him. Tradition is the family that believes this country will welcome them, even when the headlines say otherwise." She let her gaze sweep across the room, her eyes locking with both allies and skeptics. Tradition isn't arrogance. It isn't clinging to corruption and calling it sacred. Tradition is resilience. Tradition is inclusion. Tradition is the courage to be better today than we were yesterday. For a moment, silence blanketed the chamber, reverent, heavy, almost spiritual. And then, a ripple of applause rose, spreading from one side of the room to the other, until the walls themselves seemed to reverberate with the sound. Outside the chamber, her words carried further still. Commentators called it the speech America needed, a reframing of tradition not as a chain, but as a torch. Communities echoed her message in rallies, classrooms, and living rooms. The immigrant child felt seen. The activist felt recharged. The ordinary citizen, weary of division, felt hope. And in that hope lay the lesson: dignity triumphs over arrogance, truth over distortion, inclusion over exclusion. Crockett had not just silenced an opponent, she had redefined the fight. She reminded a fractured country that its greatest strength was never in guarding the gates of the past, but in daring to open the doors of the future. As she left the floor that day, the cameras caught a final image: Jasmine Crockett walking with her head high, not in defiance, but in quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when you know you've spoken not only for yourself, but for generations who came before, and generations still waiting to be heard. And somewhere, deep in the American spirit, a new understanding of tradition took root. Tradition as struggle. Tradition as reinvention. Tradition as the unbreakable dignity of those who refuse to be erased. The hero had spoken, and the echo of her words would not fade. And so, what began as a heated exchange on the House floor became something far bigger, a defining moment, a headline etched into the political story of our time: Crockett's fearless stand. What was meant as an insult designed to diminish her had instead elevated her into a symbol of courage and conviction. Thomas's arrogance, his sneering reliance on so-called tradition, had already begun to fade into irrelevance. But Crockett's words? They remained, cutting through the noise, rising above the pettiness of politics, and echoing with moral clarity. She didn't just defend herself, she redefined what tradition means for America. She turned a chamber meant to silence her into a stage where truth stood taller than any insult. And that truth is simple: our greatest tradition isn't obedience to the powerful, it's dignity in the face of arrogance, justice in the face of corruption, unity in the face of division. Crockett's stand wasn't just for her, it was for every voice that's been told to sit down, every identity dismissed as unworthy, every community left on the margins. Now the question is, what do we do with this moment? Do we let it fade into another viral clip, or do we carry it forward as a spark for change? If you believe that America's tradition is dignity, not division, if you believe that progress belongs to the people, not the powerful, then share this story. Let it be heard in homes, classrooms, workplaces, and streets. Because tradition isn't just something we inherit, it's something we build, together. And today, that tradition calls us to stand tall, to speak truth, and to never back down. The movement has already begun. Will you be part of it?